Chopin on Bach, the Doctrine of Affections. Does it hold true? Rick Ferguson, rickfergusonmusic.com. I'm thrilled to see you here. Thank you for joining me in this exploration, this wonderful little musical rabbit hole that we're going to go down just for a few minutes to explore the relationship between the well-tempered clavier of Sebastian Bach and then how a lot of those tenets that Bach was using compositionally might have carried forward with the music of Frederick Chopin. Please feel free to like this video, share this video if you have any other musically minded and geeky friends who would be interested in today's subject matter. I would very much appreciate it. And subscribe if you don't already do so. Frederick Chopin, we know that it is well established he incorporated the use both for himself but also assigned to his own piano students the Preludes and Fugues from Sebastian Bach's well-tempered clavier. We have Chopin's annotated copies of the well-tempered clavier where Chopin was including dynamic markings, tempo markings, articulation. We have a fairly clear idea of how Chopin went about interpreting, making sense, and bringing to life Bach's Preludes and Fugues, which is a wonderful thing. In addition to the well-tempered clavier, Chopin routinely assigned sonatas of Mozart as well. So it seemed that from a teaching standpoint, a pedagogical standpoint, the well-tempered clavier and Mozart sonatas were at the core of a lot of Chopin's own teaching. We're focusing on the relationship with Bach today. Chopin admired Bach's works both for their contrapuntal brilliance, but also their emotional balance. So he said, and I found a wonderful quote of Chopin, "Bach is an astronomer discovering the most marvelous stars. Beethoven challenges the universe. I only try to express the soul and the heart of man." And to me, that's very revealing and helpful. Let's do a little background into the doctrine of affections. It has its roots in Greek and Roman medical philosophy, especially the use of various musical sounds to assist in balancing the four humors of the body. Those four humors being blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This philosophy carried forward into medical practices in medieval Europe as well. So this was a continuous thing over centuries. In 1739, the German musical theorist, composer, in a lot of ways philosopher, Johann Mattheson wrote this wonderful treatise. It's huge. Der vollkommene Kapellmeister, the complete Kapellmeister. I've referred to this in a previous video where I discuss that treatise in a little bit more depth and use one of Sebastian Bach's Preludes and Fugues as an illustration. I'll link that in this video if you haven't seen it yet. In very general terms, with the Baroque doctrine of affections, especially to our discussion about the Preludes and Fugues of Sebastian Bach and then Preludes of Frederick Chopin, the choice of key, intervals that were used, how they were used, especially ascending, descending combinations, and tempo, they all combine to in some way affect the listener, to evoke a range of passions. We also need to take into consideration the dynamic expansion and growth, development of various tuning systems at this time, because that has a tremendous effect on how we experience the music that we're hearing. Let's start by hearing a fugue in G major by Johann Mattheson. If you're thinking in Doctrine of Affections terms, you're thinking, I'm hearing G major. What intervals am I hearing? And am I hearing, for instance, sequential patterns that tend to primarily rise, primarily fall? Then how does that go about affecting my experience of the piece as the listener? Here we have mostly close interval writing, but we do have sequences that involve especially ascending fourths. So this idea of ascending fourths throughout the fugue have a significant influence on how the fugue moves about. Let's listen to the fugue in G major by Johann Mattheson on harpsichord with a well-tempered tuning, a tuning that would have been developed by Johann Kirnberger, one of Mattheson's colleagues during that time period. Enjoy. That's an example of Mattheson, who wrote the treatise on the Doctrine of Affections. There was a really important precursor to Mattheson's treatise, and that was written by René Descartes, the French philosopher, mathematician, but also later in his life, metaphysical explorer. To that end, in 1649, right towards the end of Descartes' life, he wrote his own rather metaphysically oriented treatise, The Passions of the Soul. And that's where he goes into some detail, identifying and exploring what he saw to be the 6 primary passions, and to try to differentiate between actions in the human experience that were specific physical, bodily generated actions, and then those actions that were generated by the soul. He goes on to say, and this is a quote, "Affections are not the same as emotions. However, they are a spiritual movement of the mind." Him being the philosopher that he was, I've been delving into this and trying to understand it a little bit more deeply. It's a lot, but it's a fascinating treatise. He describes the 6 basic passions affect. You have admiration, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sorrow. And that the use of certain types of musical sounds, or more to the point, combinations of musical sounds, can then affect these passions or evoke an affect within the soul. It's very interesting. Moving this forward, let's focus on 3 keys, and here's some side-by-side comparisons Preludes from the Well-Tempered Clavier of Sebastian Bach with a prelude in the same key by Chopin. And let's just compare, and I'm going to leave it up to you, the viewer, the listener, just to compare and think about, do I hear any of these ideas of the doctrine of affections being carried forward? First, we'll listen to two preludes from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, G major, Book 1, G major, Book 2, followed by Chopin's Piano Prelude, you guessed it, in G major. Listen to any continuity in terms of, I guess in today's parlance, mood, expression. Is there any kind of similarity that we hear connecting these? So one thing I noticed right off the bat was the idea of arpeggiation in some way or another in all three pieces, and creating a grand spray of notes, such elegance, but very uplifting. I very much enjoyed playing those three side by side by side, and I did notice a certain kind of connection in terms of how I was affected. Next, let's do a different key. Let's go to the key of B minor. We'll hear the B minor prelude from the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And then, of course, the very well-known B minor Prelude of Chopin. And just note the change of frequency, the change of mood, and how choice in Baroque Doctrine of Affections terms, how the choice of key, intervals, tempo, how does that affect us as the listener and music lover? Finally, let's go to one of my favorite keys, B flat minor. And we're going to do the same kind of thing, but now that you've heard B minor, so we've got a major and a minor pairing, we'll do another minor key, but I'm struck by how individualized these pieces are once we change the key, but also that there really are some similarities. And this pairing in B flat minor I find to be compelling. We'll hear the Prelude from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier, and then Chopin's B flat minor piano prelude, but in terms of tempo, completely opposite sides of the spectrum. And there's still, to my ears, something that connects them. And I want to wrap up with a quote by Charles Rosen, but then also sort of give you an idea, now that you're going to hear the pieces, how they were described from Baroque terminology. Here we go, B flat minor, Bach and Chopin. Enjoy. review the three keys and some of the qualities that were attributed to these keys in terms of treatise and ideas. C major, qualities, depending on, of course, the combination of key, tempo, intervals, specifically. Serious, magnificent, fantasy, persuasiveness, brilliance. Those were qualities that tended to be attributed to G major. For B minor, those qualities or affects are patience, submission, solitary reflection, desperation. You certainly feel a lot of that. The reflection strikes me as being very cogent to the Bach Prelude, and this solitary reflection idea very much to the Chopin Prelude. B flat minor, more somber, intense emotions, terrible, the night, things associated with the night, and resignation. I'm just fascinated by this exploration that Mattheson and others were undertaking at the time, and I'll be interested in your thoughts as well. Am I off base and just sort of going down my own fun little rabbit hole and hearing things that I want to hear? I think not, but it's an interesting comparison between Bach and Chopin compositionally. I'll leave you with a little bit of information by the wonderful pianist, author, philosopher Charles Rosen from his book, The Romantic Generation. And he's talking a little bit about the relationship between Chopin and Bach. In the first half of the 18th century, the masterpieces of keyboard music appeared for the most part to be works of instruction. Almost all of Bach's published music is printed under the title of keyboard exercises. The partitas, Italian concerto, four duets, chorale preludes, Goldberg variations, of course, these are instructive works for composers as well as players. The difference was not marked at the time. And to the published music must be added the inventions for two and three voices, the art of fugue, and, of course, the well-tempered clavier, all of these specifically for the keyboard player, and almost all requiring great virtuosity. Later on, by the time we get later into the 18th century, Rosen states keyboard music had become more sociable, less professional. The amateur interest was now of primary consideration, particularly if one wished to make a profit from the sale of sheet music. We started to have the burgeoning middle class who could afford pianos and then music for them, and there was a huge market for that. Finally, we have what Rosen states in terms of comparing Chopin's use of counterpoint in his music with that of Bach's. The wonderful sonority of Chopin's writing, the exquisite spacing, the vibrant inner voices spring from an abstract structure of lines. The pianist is conscious, as he is in Bach, both of the way an individual line is sustained and of the passing of the melody from one voice to the other. It is not only in small details that Chopin displayed this art, but in the general outlines of larger forms. The lyricism and the dramatic shock in his music are equally indebted to this craft. This is the true paradox of Chopin. He is most original in his use of the most fundamental and traditional technique, aka Bach. That is what made him at the same time the most conservative and the most radical composer of his generation. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have, and please feel free to comment. Let me know your ideas about this subject and about any other subject. Thank you. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.